Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for that neural silence that just descended upon the room. Some good instincts. Welcome to the 2010 Faith and Culture Lecture. This is part of a series called the Catholic Imagination in the Arts, a lecture series that will go through the entire year. So please do keep an eye out for the other events that are scheduled. You'll see a conversation of themes throughout the year, so please do come back. I want to thank the Office of Mission and Ministry for sponsoring tonight's event. I would like to thank the Humanities Department for co-sponsoring it. My name is Michael Tomka, by the way, and I'm an assistant professor in the Humanities Department. And I would like to thank Kevin Hughes, the chair, and Marie Kelly, our administrative assistants, for all their work in helping us put this together. I would note one of the traditions for the Faith and Culture Lecture that the Humanities Department has established is that there is a reception afterwards. Now, you may say, don't all lectures have receptions with cubes of brightly colored orange cheese? Well, yes, they do. This is a slightly different way of doing things because we are a slightly different department. It puts emphasis on collegiality and conviviality. So all the desserts you'll find outside afterwards will have been made by members of the faculty. And that is a good thing, I can assure you. Really. Tonight, I want to honor another one of our traditions, which is that one of our senior humanities majors introduces the speaker. So tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Cristina Diverso, who is a humanities and Spanish double major. And in addition to being involved in all sorts of venerable activities throughout campus, also is also a student worker in the department who has made all our lives more cheerful and manageable from her interventions in our own collegial lives. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Cristina, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Department of Humanities and the Office for Mission and Ministry, I would like to welcome all of you to this year's Faith and Culture Lecture entitled Retooling the Instruments of Christ's Passion, Late Medieval Labor, Burial, and Prayer. Tonight's lecture will be given by Dr. Astell, a professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Astell received her MA in English Literature from Marquette University and her Ph.D. in Medieval English Literature from the University of Wisconsin. She later served as professor of English and chair of medieval studies at Purdue University before being appointed professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame, where she has taught courses on medieval literature and Christian spirituality. She is the author of 6 books, including Joan of Arc and Sacrificial Authorship, a survey of post-Enlightenment fictions whose authors have used Joan of Arc and the history of her martyrdom as their subject, and most recently, Eating Beauty, the Eucharist and the Spiritual Arts of the Middle Ages, in which Dr. Astell discusses the connection between beauty and faith in relation to the eating of the Eucharist through an analysis of late medieval saints. Dr. Astell is also the editor or co-editor of 4 works, including Lay Sanctity, Medieval and Modern, a study of the historical definitions of laity and sanctity through an examination of lay saints, and recently, Levinas and Medieval Literature, the difficult reading of English and rabbinic texts, a collection of 12 essays connecting the ethical philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas with various English and rabbinic writings from the Middle Ages. In addition to her many scholastic achievements, Dr. Astell is also a member of the Schoenstatt Sisters of Mary and currently serves as the Executive Secretary of the International Colloquium on Violence and Religion. Thus, it is with great pleasure that we welcome Dr. Astell this evening, a scholar whose work is truly an exemplary model of the intersection between faith and learning. Through her integration of spirituality, pedagogy, and scholarship, she explores the most fundamental questions of humanity which have persisted throughout the course of history and have been examined by philosophers and saints alike. It is this dialogue between the learned and the blessed which renders Dr. Astell's work an exceptional reflection of the mission of the Department of Humanities, which is the pursuit of truth and knowledge through the harmonious integration of faith and reason. And so, I would now ask all of you present this evening to join me in welcoming Dr. Ann Astell.
Thank you for that introduction, Christina. I think that's the sweetest introduction I've ever received. And I'm very delighted, honored, grateful for the invitation to talk to you tonight. And I thank Michael Tomko for extending it to me. Before I start, I'd like to dedicate this lecture in a special way to everyone who is named Thomas. First, middle, last.
Oh, yes.
So raise your hand if Thomas is in, and it can be in any form. It can be Thomasine, it can be Tomko. Great, okay, that's quite a few. How many of you are, and if anyone happens to be a twin, okay, it can be identical or fraternal. Any twins in the room? Oh, good. Excellent. Okay, so you are my dedicatees. Right. And also, this is my very first PowerPoint presentation, so. And somebody named Thomas helped me with it. All right. Now to begin. The illustrated Middle English poem, O Vernicle, features meditations on 24 objects, the so-called instruments of Christ's Passion. An image text, the oft-copied poem is insistent in its combination of words and pictures, which enable the devout reader to retool the instruments once used to afflict Christ as a means to examine his or her conscience in preparation for the confession of sins, indeed for death and final judgment. Despite the obvious attention the poem pays to tools, scholars have only begun to consider its significance for the late medieval world of work and workers, and thus for our understanding of the poem prayer itself as a technology of the faith. Often called an Arma Christi poem because its 24 instruments are largely identical with those depicted on shield-like Arma Christi pages in books of hours. O Vernicle is innovative in that its verse meditations deal with the instruments one by one in roughly chronological arrangement based on the Passion narratives in the Gospels, thus breaking down the static assemblage of parts in the Arma Christi pages and setting those parts in motion like props used seriatim in a drama. The image stanzas of O Vernicle provide a fragmentary, elusive narrative divided into a series of pictorial and poetic stations. The concluding image stanza, that of the sepulchre, allows for a silent mental reassembly of the individual instruments by analogy with late medieval English funerary monuments, which were regularly marked either with a coat of arms belonging to the deceased or with his trademark, including craft and merchant's marks, along with other symbols of personal identity. The Arma Christi were understood to be tools of trade with which Christ accomplished his saving work, using the very instruments that others had used against him. As Rosemary Wolfe explains, from the early Middle Ages on, the instruments of Christ's Passion held by angels were regularly depicted in Christian art in scenes of the Last Judgment. In the 15th century, however, the instruments became isolated from the Last Judgment, and they were also greatly increased in number. Wolff notes that the instruments were depicted in every medium, and often given an emblematic treatment as an individual object of occulted looking, detached from the continuous narrative of the Passion and its emotive force. This shift, I suggest, reflects a late medieval societal phenomenon in the world of human work, namely the development of the craft guilds, with their distinctive tools, liveries, and trademarks. As John C. Hirsch has astutely observed, differences in emphasis create in time a new spiritual climate, but the motivation for the change is not always apparent in the change itself. The tools of the Passion clearly became associated with the tools of the guildsmen, as is evident, for example, in the York Mystery Plays, where the bakers, as a ministry, were responsible for the play of the Last Supper, and the pinners for the enactment of the crucifixion. As this association occurred, these tools, in company with others, moved visually from the scene of the Last Judgment, while of course remaining also there, to Christian gravesites, which were always already enfolded in the Memoria Christi. Paul Binsky's important study of medieval entombment demonstrates that, quote, Christianity inherited practices or structures from the ancient world, but imposed upon them its own ethical system, unquote. Whereas the great early Christian sarcophagi erased the narrative of the person, the subject of the old eulogistic formulae, by means of the narrative of the faith, late medieval Christian tombs tended to blend the personal and the gospel narratives, returning, albeit with a critical difference to ancient practice. They are marked either with scenes from or emblematic signs of the curriculum vitae of the deceased. Binsky points, for example, to the individualizing display found on the grave of Peter Denham, a glover, which has a pair of gloves over his epitaph in Fletching, Sussex, or on the grave of the London fishmonger, Nicholas de Ombrede, which has a splendid fish at the base of his cross brass and tackle around 1350. By the end of the Middle Ages, the simplest graves of the abbots and priests, writes Binsky, were marked with elementary signs of the person within, a crozier or chalice and paten, as social attributes. In keeping with an old tradition, the tomb slab of the architect Hugh Levergier, who died in 1263, similarly identifies the deceased by the tools of his profession, including compasses and square and staff. Can you see that? Now, this is just out of deference to Mike Tonko. As a modern example, we have the tombs of John Keats, young English poet, and beside him the tomb of Joseph Severn. And you'll see the signs of their professions. As Binsky's study shows, much could be gained by the comparison of medieval and ancient marks of identity, including tool depictions. Building upon Gerhard Zimmerer's study of representations of technicians in Greek and Roman art, Serafina Cuomo has focused attention on the mortuary iconography of a single instrument, the carpenter's square, or set square, libella, or norma in Latin, diabetes in Greek. Examining 20 depictions of libellae, most of them dating from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the very time period from which the Arma Christi tradition in its earliest form originates, Cuomo argues against the commonplace view, whereby the artistic renditions of techne, or ars, have generally been seen as down-to-earth, straightforward snapshots of everyday life. In support of the claim that depictions of tools and funerary art could both reflect reality and convey some symbolic meaning, Guoma's work, upon which I will draw in my interpretation of the Carpenter's Square depicted in British Library Additional Manuscript 22029, an O'Vernical manuscript, opens up an original new means of approach, a new set of questions at the present moment, when for medievalists as for classicists, the interpretation of individual technical motifs is still at an embryonic stage. Technical motifs abound in O'Vernical. At the conclusion of her magisterial study of 18 illustrated copies of that poem, Anne Nichols comments on the lack of evidence about the medieval reception of the poem. You know it was popular. She goes on to suggest that the drawings themselves, no matter how conventional, tell us something about how the artist-designer read the poem. These are all personalized manuscripts from the first to the last. None of them is the same. And they're all reflective of personal devotion. Tonight I want to examine one of these personalized manuscripts, British Library Additional Manuscript 22029. Inscribed in the early 15th century on a vellum roll, 4 feet 5 inches in length, 5 inches in width, Additional 22029 has striking illustrative features. Its unusual penchant for detail and embellishment, its threefold repetition of the vernicle, and its particular depictions of the Carry Cross and of the Sepulchre, which provide a mirror of its original readers and their interpretation of the poem. The sequence of image stanzas leads the reader not only to remember and to repent of his or her sins, but also to recognize his or her own face in the painted face of Christ, his or her own work in the cross-borne mid-manuscript by Christ, his own grave in the open sepulchre with which the poem ends. These pictures, pictorial and verbal, typically prompt a prayerful response of contrition and petition. In this way, the cruel instruments of the Passion are retooled as a technology of meditation, ethical reform, and salvation. In this lecture tonight, I argue in particular that the instruments depicted in Additional Manuscript 22029 have a metaphoric power to symbolize vice and virtue that depends to a large extent upon their metonymic relationship to actual tools used by the manuscript's early readers as markers of personal identity. As Nichols instructs us to observe, the artist of Additional 22029 excels in an accurate representation of actual tools and instruments. She points in particular to his drawing of the tenons of ladders and the slip joints of pincers, but also to datable detail in other images. As we shall see, the artist, who is almost certainly also the poem's scribe, has substituted a carpenter's square for the cross Christ carries on the Via Crucis. This substitution keys in a profound theological theme of Thomasine twinning with Christ as image and likeness, whose illustrated holy face in the manuscript faces the reader not once but thrice as a mirror of self-examination, whose cross on Calvary spells a T, and whose glorified wounds appear finally to the reader's sight to invoke his confession with St. Thomas not only of sin, but also of faith in the resurrection from the dead. Additional 22029, like most manuscripts of O'Vernical, is a roll. Wolfe describes roll prayers in general as the poor man's book of hours, and Russell Robbins mentions extant rolls of private prayers, some of them comparable in size to O'Vernical rolls. The roll format, Nichols observes, allows the reader the freedom to meditate cyclically, to move back as well as forward. The manuscript's drawings, accompanied by verses of varying lengths, mark mental stations along a quasi-processional path. A functional device, the image enables synthesis and recall as it provides a mental locus for a set of related thoughts charged with emotion and ethical resolve. Mary Carruthers insists, a stylistic figure, an image, signals not just a subject matter, race, but a mood, modus, color, an attitude, intentio, and a reading tempo. The notion of a variable tempo of reading helps to explain the different lengths of the 24 image stanzas. The shortest and most numerous stanzas, 13 in all, are quatrains, each composed of 2 rhymed couplets. 6 stanzas are 6 lines in length. 2 are 8 lines long. 3 stanzas are much longer than the rest. The first in the sequence, that concerning the Veronica, and the last, concerning the sepulchre, are 14 lines long. And the poem about the cross carried to Calvary, the 14th of 24 stanzas, is 18 lines in length. These 3 longest image stanzas obviously provide anchor points for the rhetorical beginning, middle, and end of the meditation, while the variation in length from stanza to stanza throughout the roll keeps interest from flagging during the course of an extended spiritual exercise. From the beginning, the open tomb is the target or scopos of the compositional ductus, the flow and movement of the series as a whole. The starting point of the meditation is important because it energizes, or fails to energize, the entire meditation. Carruthers notes that the craft of memoria requires energizing devices to put it in gear and keep it interested and on track by arousing emotions of fear or delight, anger, wonder, and awe. Among these devices, Carruthers points especially to the stylistic ornament called enargeia, which is a bringing before the eyes, a vivid word painting, which sometimes takes the form of ekphrasis. The roll, that was its earliest owner's prayer tool, begins powerfully with an image of an image, the vernacle or Veronica, literally the true image of the holy face of Christ, as it was preserved in bloodstains on the veil of Saint Veronica, who, according to the Legenda Aurea, used it to wipe his countenance as he struggled forward on the way to Calvary. Christ's face on cloth within the frame, in additional 22029, is finely detailed and charged with mystery. The complicated syntax of the opening lines of the poem allows for a richness of multiple meanings. The opening words, the vernacle, il honor, makes the relic itself the object of veneration, but the added pronoun him at the end of the line and at the head of the clause, that they nod, confuses the sense. Interpreted in one way, the vernacle is in apposition to him, that is, to Christ, the artistic agent of the image on the cloth, suggesting through a complex paranomnesia the Son's status as the Word, the true image, vera plus icon, of the Father, and the Father's own vernacular, in Latin vernaculus, expression. Interpreted yet another way, the vernacle names the I as someone created in the image and likeness of God, Genesis 1:26, a living icon that honors God in speech and deed, someone called, as it were, to be Christ's twin, conformed to him as the Apostle Thomas was. Noting in the image the fivefold imprint of the whole face of Christ, his mouth, nose, eyes, beard, and hair, the speaker whose eye the reader appropriates accuses himself of sinning in his 5 senses. Shield me, Lord, for that and me leave, that he have sinned with me which fever. The use of the verb shield invokes the idea of the armor Christi as a protecting shield. The reader asks forgiveness for sins of the mouth, giving scandal, false oaths, backbiting, boasting, all forms of misrepresentation, of false or inappropriate verbal imaging. At the start of an extended meditation conducted through the serial conjoining of pictures and poetry, the renunciation of the sins of the mouth thus purifies the one who prays, who vocalizes the text on the scroll, and who prepares thereby for oral, sacramental confession. Renouncing false words, the penitent becomes a true word, and likeness to the Word. A side glance at Julian of Norwich's reflection on the vernacle confirms the association of that relic with Trinitarian meditation on the Son of God and on humanity, created through him in the image and likeness of the Trinity. Like O Vernacle, Julian's visionary experience in meditations begins with the beholding of Jesus' face. Her second sight of the face of the crucifix, held before her as she lay dying, reminds her, in the 10th chapter of the long text of her showings, of the holy vernacle of Rome, in which the blessed face of the fairest of heaven appears so discolored and so far from fairheit. The theo-aesthetic question, how could the image be so discolored, prompts her meditation, which begins with a remembrance that the blessed full Trinity made mankind to his image and to his likeness. The human likeness to God at creation, marred by sin, must be restored through a recreation that likens humanity to Christ, the Son of God and Mary. As Julian understands, the vernacle symbolizes Christ's incarnation, whereby the Son of God, the Father's true image, marred himself as leap to man in this deadly leaf, as man mit bag with ooted guilt. The artist of additional 22029, sensitive to the theme of the restoration of Christ's image within the penitent and to the memorial power of the Veronica, provides the viewer with not one but 3 vernacles, attaching the second and third to stanzas 9 and 22 respectively. In his illustrations of these stanzas, Christ's face is shown frontally and detached from his body, as in the opening image stanza. This is the blindfold, and it's supposed to be in front of his face, but he's depicted it behind. If these 3 Veronicas and their accompanying prayers work to reform the reader into Christ's moral likeness, to refashion him or her as Christ's twin, the image stanza of the Way of the Cross reminds the reader of the craft Jesus shared with St. Thomas the Apostle, also called the twin. Unlike other stanzas which first invoke the respective tool, the stanza on the carried cross, shown hooked over Christ's shoulder as in an L shape, begins with an address to Christ rather than to the cross. Stanza 14 focuses on Christ's bloody footsteps, bloody with the shedding of his precious blood, and narrates his walk to Calvary, including a report of his consoling speech to the weeping women of Bethlehem and of Jerusalem. Weep not for me, woe, but for your children also. The final petition of stanza 14 begs pardon from the one who steppeth forwards, and grace for all who go whither devotion, on pilgrimage, on horse, or on foot. Set in the midst of other verse sets, the stanza symbolizes the spiritual exercise as a whole, characterizing it as a meditative movement of walking from station to station. In this manuscript, as in most vernacle manuscripts, the illustration depicts the first line of the stanza, showing Jesus as the cross-bearer. In additional 22029, however, Jesus bears upon his shoulder a nail-studded carpenter's square as a cross and stands on a mound similar to that in which the tau cross, a crucifixion, is raised in the illustration for stanza 23. The artist has, it seems, translated the bloody footprints metaphorically into the feet of an artisan's measurement, performed with a set square. As Serafina Cuomo notes, the labella is an instrument that actually combines a right angle, norma, with a measuring rod, regula. Nichols calls the drawing curious and explains its oddity as deriving from an unidentified ARMA page. She really has no idea. I emailed her, that's what she The artist's substitution here of a carpenter's square for the tau or Latin cross, which appear in the illustrations of stanzas 23 and 24, respectively, cannot simply, I submit, be explained by the space limitations. The choice to use this particular unusual device from the world of craft and trades must be understood as a personalizing feature, a sign of the artist's response to the imagined scene, and perhaps to the wish of the original owner of the role, who identified his own daily labor and tool use as a carpenter, mason, or architect, and showed his way of life with Christ's way of the cross. Louis Real's multi-volume iconography of Christian art does not even mention the L-shaped cross or carpenter square as a Christian form. Real does, of course, list the square as one of the attributes of Jesus' adoptive father, St. Joseph, whom Scripture identifies as a carpenter, as well as that of St. Thomas the Apostle, known for his building of churches in India. The set square, as a possible attribute of Jesus, derives therefore from at least two sources, from Joseph and his known trade as a carpenter, in which Jesus also participated, according to Mark 6:3, and from Thomas. Scripture calls Thomas the twin, and Christian tradition, beginning at least as early as the apocryphal Acts of Thomas, imagined him therefore to resemble Jesus, a resemblance in physical appearance and a carpenter's trade that allowed in turn for an amazing series of legendary identifications between the two. Likened to Christ in multiple ways, Thomas is a symbol of the true disciple, a vernacle of the vernacle. A square is thus appropriate for Jesus in a literal historical sense as a mark of his trade as a carpenter and apostolic commission. In the context of the way of the cross, especially as described in stanza 14, however, Jesus' carrying of a set square, a simple tool used with varying degrees of sophistication by carpenters, stonemasons, surveyors, and architects, recalls symbolically the prophecies both about the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, and about his rebuilding of the temple in 3 days. The Gospel, according to St. John, pits the misinterpretation of this sentence by Jesus' adversaries against his own intended meaning. But he spoke of the temple of his body, a meaning understood only retrospectively by his disciples, who remembered that he had said this after his resurrection from the dead on the third day. In Johannine theology, the same Christ, through whom all things were made, the architectural logos of the universe, also rebuilds the sanctuary of his own body, destroyed by death, when he rises from the grave. For St. Paul, the restored temple of Christ's body is also the church, his mystical body, made of living stones, built on Christ the cornerstone. Later church buildings became the expression of, as well as a means and security for, this living church. The Christian use of the symbol of the set square as an attribute of Christ in a prayer roll, like additional 22029, thus extends the symbolism that was already attached to the tool in antiquity, as well as adding new meanings. Studying its appearance, usually an emblematic combination with other tools symmetrically arranged on the funerary monuments of ancient technicians, Cuomo concludes that the object possessed a rich, multi-layered complexity of meanings. It indicated emblematically the trade of the deceased and his membership in a group of tradesmen who shared expertise, who contribute professionally to society as a whole. It expressed his pride in God-willed activities during his earthly life. The labella, like the axe, was also a symbol of death, the great equalizer and judge. Placed on a sarcophagus, itself a little building, symbolic of other dwelling places, the labella, as a tool of building, also became a symbol of the afterlife. Used in late antiquity by architects in the construction of Christian churches, the labella participated in what Cuomo calls the spiritualization of architecture in the Christian era. In the Christian churches of the Middle Ages, the labella retained a multivalent symbolism which would have affected the reader's reception of the 14th stanza in additional 22029. Depicted as the attribute of saints and on the graves of craftsmen like the architect Hugh Le Bergier, the labella was also frequently inscribed in stone as a mason's mark, since stonemasons as well as carpenters used the tool for leveling. Now, these aren't all mason's marks. They tend to be very simple. It's like that whole row there. And you notice there's something like a square. Girling describes these marks as the personal marks of masons, comparable to the personal marks of the merchants, and sometimes practically identical with them. As for example, in cases where a mason becomes a quarry owner, okay, so you move from tradesman to merchant, and perhaps get elevated to heraldry. As an example, Girling cites the inscription of a hammer and a set square on one of two shields, the other showing a hammer and an axe, on the exterior of a church tower in Ugashall, Suffolk, beneath another inscription requesting prayers for the souls of John and Marjorie Bale. Girling speculates that the marks are the signature of the carver of the inscription, who may well have been the master builder or architect. Jennifer Alexander's magisterial study of masons' marks in English cathedrals confirms that the marks, which consist of a series of intersecting lines in a geometric pattern, were a form of autograph. Marks may resemble masons' tools, Alexander observes, pointing to an example in the Lincoln Cathedral that is clearly based on a mason's square. If the artist or owner of additional 22029 recognized in the set square carried by Jesus to Calvary a tool of personal and professional use, perhaps even a mark of self-identification as someone named Thomas, the role in its poem as a prayer tool would have had an enhanced value. Like the image of the mobile cross carried to Calvary, the image of the sepulchre in additional 22029 is unlike that found in any surviving Old Vernical manuscript. Nicholas classifies the illustrations of this final stanza as belonging to one of three groups: those showing one, an empty tomb; second, Christ's recumbent body within the sepulchre; and three, the so-called image of pity, a half figure, arms crossed at the wrists, standing in the tomb, which is what we have here. She lists additional 22029 as belonging to the image of pity group, but she admits that it does not in fact belong there. Christ is pictured from the waist up, standing in the sepulchre, and he shows his wounds, but his hands are not crossed. Since he holds the vexilla, the victory banner, and the sepulchre is inscribed Christus Resurgens, she writes, the image is more properly classified as a resurrection. Alone among Old Vernical manuscripts, then, additional 22029 depicts the risen Christ as emerging from a radiance that bursts the top of the rectangular tomb, his head halo. Glorified, his body is nevertheless visibly wounded and still bleeding. You know, the manuscript's actually in color, so I mean, there's lots of red all the way through. Christ's left hand is raised, as it were, in a greeting of peace, a gesture that exposes the flow of blood from the nail wound in his palm. With his left hand, he holds the decorated cross-topped rod of a flowing banner of victory. What explains the uniqueness of this image, which combines features of two different narratives? The biblical narrative of pity, John 19:22, and they shall look upon him whom they have pierced, and that of joyous Easter triumph over death. The illustration seems to reinforce the Thomasine association attached to image stanzas 14, the Carpenter's Square, and 23 of the Town Cross, by evoking the risen Lord as he appeared to the doubting Thomas when he invited him to put his finger in the nail hole and see his wounded hands. Additional 22029's Christ rises in radiance from the still closed sepulchre, much as Christ in the Gospel's account passes through the shut doors to encounter Thomas and the other apostles. Beholding the wounds, hearing Christ's voice, Thomas acknowledges his lordship and divinity. The episode, recorded only in the Gospel according to St. John, is appropriately recalled as the last of a series of image stanzas that have simultaneously given the reader a sight of Christ's relics and challenged them to a deeper insight into themselves and Christ. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. Additional 22029 sepulchre is moreover itself decorated, not only with the text Christus Resurgens, but also with heraldic insignia, 2 bowen bats between 3 flowers, which duplicate the flowers at the 3 points of the cross topping the banner. The tomb decorations are rudimentary, but they introduce into the series of illustrations at its conclusion a heraldic note appropriate to the Arma Christi theme. The body of Christ in this last illustration is not visually surrounded by emblematic representations of all the instruments of the Passion as on an Arma Christi page. Instead, the roll format, which effectively places all the images on a single surface, allows the previously depicted tools to surround the closing sepulchre scene. The poem's final verses and its accompanying image, which depicts a rectangular tomb rather than the biblical cave of burial against which a stone was rolled, strongly associates Christ's tomb with the penitent's own grave. The penitent asks for the grace of perfect contrition. Ervadi nigravali, stodali maya domus died, to that dome clone with Buddha fried, and went to bliss and company, there as none shall never deal, but dwell in bliss with that Lord pricked, wherever is die and never nicked. And less shall with Guten end, Jesu Christ was letter send. Referring to Christ's resurrection from the tomb, the reader begs for the grace to rise from his or her grave on the day of judgment, and to join the Lord in the blessed company of his saints. By the same rhetorical move that links the Holy Sepulchre with the penitent's grave and Christ rising with the soul's immortality, the poet effectively joins Christ's arms, Christ's tools, to those of the Christian worker who must work out his salvation, in part by using them rightly. At a time in England when sepulchres were mass-produced and highly stylized, Nigel Saul remarks, a wide range of emblematic devices was on offer. Shields of arms to attest lineage and connections, collars and bastard feudal devices to indicate magnet affiliations, merchants' marks and distinctive footrests to show the trades of the merchant class, as well as symbols of personal piety. Historians of trademarks and merchants' marks have seen that these marks, passed on from generation to generation within a single family, often gradually acquired a heraldic character. There are 3 different shields from the Talk family, and you can see that the first one there in the upper left, they are tools, so they began that way. And the TR, the name Talk, something Richard Talk. And then became simplified, and the flowers, the little wreaths, became more outstanding. And then finally, most heraldic of all, okay, the T has become a tau cross. Appearing on the walls of English churches and stained glass windows, as well as on tombs, these marks, joined with depictions of tools used by the faithfully parted, the shears used by tailors. The wool, these are the kind of slabs that you have on the floor of a church. They were brass engravings. The wool sacks of walnut. Isn't that neat? Also shuttles, teasel holders, scissors, and an awl used by weavers, the crooks of shepherds, a butcher's block brush, a carpenter's square. In this memorial context, the individual tools of the Arma Christi as visual and verbal objects of meditation signify more than tools once used long ago by others. Male or female, writes Anthony Bale, the users and audiences of the Arma Christi return us to the highly personal sphere. The attested use of another O. Vernicle manuscript, London Wellcome Historical Medical Library, manuscript 632, as a birth girdle, is perhaps the most telling proof of the association of Christ's tools with the world of women's labor and with human labor in general. For a pregnant woman who could hope to obtain indulgences for herself and for her child through praying O Vernicle, the concluding sepulchre image stanza carried the additional meaning of a literal delivery from death and a final victory over it. One may only suppose that for an English laywoman, Eleanor Sibsey, who owned the prayer roll in the 16th or 17th century, as for women of the 15th century, additional 22029's depiction of Christ passing through in a radiance, passing through the wall of the sepulchre, would have resonated with the narrative of his own virgin birth, even as it depicted a pious pregnant reader's hope, especially toward a multi-layered giving of birth, physical and spiritual, from her womb. Whether the viewer saw his own set square and that carried by Christ as a cross to Calvary, or was inspired by the image of personalized labor to substitute the tools of his own calling, thus expanding the panoply of tools used in the work of salvation, the image stanzas of additional 22029 provide a bridge between the worlds of physical and spiritual work. To the extent that one's own work and suffering through penitence and renewed dedication became Christ, one might be restored in him to the divine likeness figured in the vernicle and symbolized at another remove by St. Thomas the Apostle's twinship with Christ. In bridging the metaphorical distance between historical tool use in the Passion narrative and personal deeds of vice and virtue, medieval readers' own use of actual tools became metonymically to the fore in a new way, tool extending to tool. Remembering them proved an effective way to come face to face with oneself, with death, and with Christ the vernicle.
We have time, I know that I mentioned the desserts, but we still have time for a few questions, which Professor Stelling graciously agreed to talk.
Relationship between merchant tools and carpentry tools and iconography, did it have anything to do with the rising merchant class in the Middle Ages or no?
Well, yes, definitely. But I want to kind of back it up to the rise of the guilds, and where you had, and the merchant class sort of emerges, and is associated with those guilds and became guilds too. I'm not an expert on guild history at all, but this is the time where there's that new social structure in place. So one of the first symbols I showed was the woolier's mark. And so he was a wool merchant, right? But how he rose to that status, he probably had a lower post at one point, or somebody in his family did. He worked his way up. Yes.
And isn't it true that that one aspect of the character of the guild is that the members of the guild have certain common practices of prayer and liturgical aspects to their membership and their communion in the guild. Right? So does it make sense to say that there's a kind of two-way giving of meaning to the tools and the practices?
You know, the guilds would have their meetings and they have their patron saints, and on those feast days they would have plays and games, and so much of Middle English literature, you know, also has an association with the guilds. Yes.
Can you guess anything about the original owner of this vertical roll from the tools and the illustrations there? I mean,
well, as you could see, as the paper went on, I became more and more. I didn't. It started. I think, oh, it must have been a carpenter, but then I thought, oh, it might have been a mason. And then there was that woman who owned it in the 17th century. But I was looking for sibses, you know, because this is the kind of thing that would have passed on within a family, right? So if you could, you know, kind of figure out, you know, where that particular branch of the Sibsey family was, you know, I was starting to see if there's a, you know, if there would be like a St. Thomas Church, for instance. There's all kinds of different ways in which it could have been personalized. So, but I think, you know, I know probably some of you were kind of doubtful when I identified that carrying cross as a carpenter's square. It's so odd. I mean, you ever seen a carpenter's square with 2 nails in it? Which is, you actually don't see images of the cross carried to Calvary with nails in it either. I mean, so that's the other thing that's very strange. It's almost as if the artist had to add nails, you know, to make sure that it was a cross, you know, that you would think of it as a cross. But by the time you get to the end of the poem, and you know, there's that very unique resurrection scene, there's a pattern, you know, there's a kind of theological pattern from the beginning to the end of the manuscript. Yes.
Thanks for talking. That was really interesting. I'm wondering actually about this image of the square as sort of the measuring device. I was thinking, I mean, I understand the sort of proximate context of the guilds, but I was wondering about sort of biblical intertextuality here and thinking of the image of the plumb line in the book of Isaiah, sort of this ancient measuring device that probably would have involved pins. I mean, if it was an actual line, when I've done sort of work in masonry, you actually use a string or something and you sort of tie it down on the ends. You might nail it down, in fact, and try to get a straight level in that sense. So I'm just wondering about the kind of use of these measuring devices, and then Christ as the norm that is sort of a positive measuring line rather than the line of destruction talked about by Isaiah.
I think, you know, you bring up a really good point. Every time, you know, you're participating in the liturgy, right, you bring something to the liturgy, you know, and aspects of the text that's read, that's heard, are going to light up for you because of personal association. And the image of the plumb line, it was very prominent in that picture of the masons building the cathedral. It doesn't appear among the 24 instruments of the Lord's Passion. But there's some variation about how many instruments you have, and as Wolf said, there's a tendency for the number to increase. So I think, you know, part of the impulse might have been, you know, to try to think, well, what was actually used? You know, like a lantern counts as a tool, right? A lantern carry, you know, or the little container that had the vinegar in it. So, you know, and there's many tools that were used, and you have to think, well, what tools do I use? And you have to do that.
Just a comment, and as you were talking, and what you just said there further reminded me of a Jose Saramago novel I read years ago, where he has all the tradesmen sitting around saying, well, God must have been a hooper, for he gathered the waters into the barrels of the sea, and then the other one says, no, he must have been a carpenter, etc. And they just all are competing to see who can decide which union God belongs to. But it's just, I had always thought that was just kind of an amusing little scene, but it seems as if it was a really likely conversations would be carried on.
Yes. Just a quick question. You mentioned the incorporation of Christ tools into women's labor, particularly childbirth. Would you like to say a little bit more about that?
Well, that particular roll of old vertical is larger, and it's very worn. It was used, and and I guess a pregnant woman would come, and and wrap it around her, and there most of the manuscripts have a little prayer at the end, where a prayer for some kind of indulgence, and we have other examples of relics like the girdle of the Saint Blessed Mother supposedly dropped, into the hands of St. Thomas, where he appears again, was venerated at Westminster Cathedral, and the Queen of Edward III's queen used it in her many pregnancies.
I was struck by an earlier question or observation that Mark Schiffman made about the two-way movement, and perhaps you said something about this in the talk that I missed, but as you were explaining the significance of these items, you were stressing the identification that these things that would be part of one's life you would see as belonging to Christ in a certain way, and that way you would be moved to identify yourself with Christ. Would that work the other way too, that the carpenter would see the rule as something that belonged to Christ, and therefore then the tool itself would become, in a certain sense, sanctified, and then the work that you would do would then be sanctified, that the work itself would be a kind of a meditation because of that bridge that was made in the art. I wonder if that was part of the idea, and perhaps you...
I think it really belongs to the spirituality of the guilds. And St. Joseph, the cult of St. Joseph came to the fore at the same time. An idea that Christian life could be lived in its simplicity and its everydayness, and become a way of sanctity. Simone Weil, I have a lot longer version of this paper, but she has beautiful meditations about spiritual mysticism at work, and she went back to the guilds of the Middle Ages, as an example of that. She tries to describe what it's like. I removed it for reasons of length. She does a comparison of two women pregnant in a prison. No, the one woman's in a prison and the other woman is not, and they're both assigned the task of sewing a garment. And both of them are concerned to do it really well. The woman in the prison, because if she fails to do it well, she'll be rebuked. The woman who's maybe awaiting the birth of her first child, sewing the same kind of garment in her home, is also very careful to do it well, but not out of fear. And in both cases, there's something sort of beyond the horizon of the actual task. An object of fear or an object of love. And so she says that one of the ways that you can spiritualize any task is to become conscious of that other for whom you are doing it. Right? And she believed that in the Middle Ages it was much more common for people to have that sort of spiritual attitude toward it.
This is really indulgent as a moderator to say that I think my question should be the last question. But I kind of ask it on behalf of a lot of the students here who are going to be graduating soon and hopefully moving on to their own line of work. I wonder, is there any continuity with how we look at work in human life today from the moment you're looking at now? I'm thinking of what you just presented richly, and then we move to the 19th century with Keats, and his kind of stands out, and he's an artist, right? It's maybe only artists at that point can really claim this relationship to work. Is there room for this today? Has our conception of the importance or the role of work in human life changed? And where does this go to contemporary times? Speculative, of course.
Well, I mentioned Simone Weil, so writing at the time of, she worked in a factory for a while, and found, she was, had her doctor's degree from the Sorbonne, and signed up to work in an assembly line to see, and found it, that she couldn't think. The pace was so fast, and she was always in fear, of something going wrong, losing her job, or getting yelled at. And she said that's when the experience of affliction entered into her. But her great concern was to try to think how that kind of work, could be spiritualized. And after her conversion, after she had a mystical experience, then she went back and reflected again about that factory work experience and tried to think, well, okay, how could we modify that system? She said, well, you have to carry a weight. Well, what if you had just a little more time to carry that weight, so that you could connect it with the weight of a cross, or with, just to have a little bit more time to symbolize, what you were doing. And she did some thought experiments about how you could use tools. I think, one exercise we did in grade school, I had Franciscan sisters when I was to teach me in grade school. And at the beginning of every homework assignment, I don't know if any of you had the same thing, you had to write JMJ, and sometimes JMJF. So that, that you would, at the beginning of every homework assignment, you would kind of dedicate it to Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and invoke maybe St. Francis. Or when I was in college at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I thought, well, I can't really put JMJ at the top of every homework assignment. But so I put a little fish in the corner, a little fish, just as a reminder to myself why I was doing this homework assignment. Right? And lo and behold, I had one very smart professor who was a linguist, and he called me and he said, "Are you a Christian?" It was kind of a neat experience. But you have to be a creative and try to think, well, what can I do, to break up my day a little bit, to remind me what I'm doing all this for. What's the ultimate horizon of my work, and I'm fashioning myself as I'm doing my work. When you use a tool, it just doesn't produce something in the world outside. It affects us. Right? So how am I using my tools, and what tools am I using? Some of them, maybe some tools we use don't build the kingdom. Maybe then we have to think whether we want to use those tools. I really got into this manuscript, as you can see. At first I thought it's a poem that people have said it was not very good poetry. The drawings aren't great. It survives in this little roll, so it's not an expensive deluxe manuscript. Why would anybody study something like that? And at first I thought it would be something I could just write quickly. Right? But instead, I found myself going deeper and deeper into this poem and realizing, how profound it was, and actually how complex. I haven't talked much about the text, but there's a lot there. And what you have to do is allow yourself to enter into the spiritual exercise, because otherwise it's something on a page. You got to use it yourself, I think, to have it come alive. Thank you for that great question.